right, so The Lost Ones. This is a novel by Anita Frank, published very appropriately on Halloween, 31st of October of 2019. And as I understand it, this is her debut novel, though she's published a few novels since then. And this one is a very definite, proper, old-fashioned Gothic ghost story. It is a period novel. It is set in 1917, so the final year into 1918, I believe, of World War One. It's late 1917, early 1918, but World War One, and it centers around a young woman named Stella Marcham. And Stella was a nurse. This is all before the story begins, okay? She was a nurse serving at the front in France during the war, during the First World War, and her fiance, Gerald, who she had known since they were both very young. They fell in love very young. They're now engaged and all of that. And he is serving with the military, the British Army, in the war. And he is killed. He isn't killed outright. He is badly blinded, I believe it is. We find this out later on in the novel. It's not really a spoiler, but, because this is all before the story of the novel actually begins. But it's important to understand Stella's backstory, and we learn more about it as time goes along. But that Gerald is brought in, and he happens to be brought in to where she is serving as a nurse, and without recognizing her, without understanding who's with him, because he's so far gone at this point, he talks about how much he loves his fiancée, Madeline, and then dies in her arms. And she is understandably deeply traumatized by this. Nothing in her life has prepared her for this moment. It has wrecked, as far as she's concerned, the entire rest of her life, all of her hopes, her plans, her dreams. She adores Gerald. She is hopelessly distraught by his death, and she isn't recovering from it. She isn't able to function even, really. And so she's actually dismissed from the nursing service, nursing corps, whatever it's called, and she is sent home to her parents, and continues to be in such a deep and profound depression that they are actually considering, she finds out when she overhears this, that they're considering having her maybe sent away to some kind of asylum, because they think she is suffering too much mentally, and that this will be the thing to help her. Personally, I wouldn't send my worst enemy to an early 20th century mental asylum. But, that's, I know a little bit more about them, perhaps, than her parents would have, because it wasn't well understood what these places were, or how ineffective, frankly, they were. But anyway, I digress. So she finds this out, and she's obviously very concerned. She knows enough herself that she does not want to end up in a place like that. And it's around this same time that Stella's sister, Madeline, Madeline's husband, Hector Brightwell, shows up at the Marcham's home. Stella's sister, Madeline, was a rock for her when she lost Gerald. And she, she's always, she loved her sister anyway, but that really bonds them very deeply. She can't forget her sister's kindness. And when Hector shows up a little bit unexpectedly at the Marchams and says that, because which the family knows, Madeline is now pregnant. She had had a couple of miscarriages, but she is finally pregnant. The pregnancy is progressing well, but Hector has sent Madeline out to live in the country. They were living in Hector's house in London, But and this is something I think a lot of people don't realize. The Second World War Blitz is very, very famous, but in fact, during the First World War, London was bombed on several occasions by the Germans using Zeppelins, believe it or not. Um, and naturally, that is a very dangerous situation. Hector is very concerned for Madeline's health and well-being for the pregnancy. And he's very aware that because of his duties with the military as an officer, that he's often, away from the house. So she's on her own a lot. And with the Zeppelin attacks and all, he decides, send her to the country. They have a country estate that's been in his family for some time now. And his father has passed away. His mother still lives there. She lives there with a paid companion, Miss Scott, and with, the household servants. And he decides that Madeline should just go and live at Grayswick, the estate, with his mother, because that way she's safe from the Zeppelin attacks. Madeline doesn't particularly want to do this. Mrs. Brightwell, Senior, Hector's mother, she's a bit of a tough old thing. Very, very firm, very set in her ways, very rigid, not a very nice person at all, not a bad or an evil person, just, I think what once upon a time might have been referred to as a bit of a battle axe. And, but, she agrees that for, the safety of the pregnancy and all that, it's the best thing. So she does go along with it. It's not like she's forced, but she's not happy there. And she's particularly concerned when strange things start happening. And Madeline, becomes convinced that Grayswick is haunted. And this is very frightening to her. And Hector, says to Madeline, or says to Stella, that he thinks Madeline would be better off if she were joined by Stella. That way she's got her sister there with her. She's got someone that she feels, happier being around, better company for her. It would make her feel better. And, Stella can kind of, talk her out of some of these strange fancies that Madeline has developed, which are probably a result of the pregnancy. Why people thought, and I think still to a degree in some circles, think pregnant women are somehow like crazy or his, batty or whatever. I really couldn't begin to guess. But there's this idea that pregnant women, that somehow their brains aren't quite right. And, which is, yeah. But that's the situation. So Stella, first of all, she misses her sister. She's thrilled at the opportunity to be there for her sister in a similar way to how Madeline had been there for her in her time of need. So she's more than happy to go, but also this is a way to get away from her parents. She is worried about what they might do, particularly with this whole plan of sending her away. She thinks, well, this will show that I'm not as bad off as they think. I am, I'm fine. I may be still deeply in mourning for Gerald and, still dressing like a widow, but I'm going to go, And they send her, when she does leave to go to Grayswick, her mother tells her to take Annie. Annie is one of the servants, Annie Burroughs, and she is the daughter of a man who many years before had helped to try and save Madeline's and Stella and Madeline's grandmother and sister when their house caught fire. He comes and he tries to warn the family. He helps to get a lot of the family out, but unfortunately, as I say, Madeline and Stella's sister and their grandmother are both killed in the fire. or die as a result of the fire, to be more accurate in the sister's case. And also, Mr. Burroughs unfortunately dies in during his efforts trying to save the Marchams from this fire that breaks out during the night. And they've taken his daughter in as a servant, as a way to look after her, to support her. And Stella doesn't really like Annie. She doesn't hate her or anything like that, but Annie is odd, and she's noticed several times that Annie behaves oddly and seems to talk to herself and just is weird. And she doesn't like her. And she is reluctant. She's very reluctant at first to bring Annie, but as her mother points out, she would be expected to bring a servant with her to a house like Grayswick, because she shouldn't be a burden on the servants that are taking care of Grayswick, the Brightwell's servants. This is what one does in that social strata, is one brings one's own lady's maid with you to look after your needs, And so she reluctantly agrees, and they head out to Grayswick, and, she figures, well, it'll be good to be with Madeline. She's not really going to have to spend time with Annie because Annie is going to be, doing work, and it'll be fine. It won't be fun, but it'll be fine. And, they arrive at Grayswick, and, it's a bit surprisingly run down. Mrs. Brightwell, who is still she is now effectively the dowager, but she is running the household still. And Madeline, for whatever reason, just, even though it's really now her place because it's her husband's home, she decides, I guess, to just let her. Path of least resistance and all of that. And, Mrs. Brightwell blames the war. They can't get the staff. Normally it would be much better. The gardens would be much nicer. The house would be much better. But, servants are hard to come by. So it is what it is. And, and Mrs. Brightwell really, she runs that house. She runs Madeline. She runs Miss Scott, the companion. She runs everybody. And, the minute that Stella shows up, obviously with Annie in tow as her servant, Mrs. Brightwell's going to run them as well. And, within days of her arrival, this is when Stella really begins to realize that Madeline believes the house is haunted. And at first she's rather concerned for Madeline's mental state, but then she too starts seeing and hearing strange things. And she becomes convinced as well that there is something strange, something going on at Grayswick. And she's been there a little while, I think a few weeks at this stage, when Hector, Madeline's husband, returns to Grayswick, bringing a friend with him, a Mr. Tristan Shear, who he acts at first like, this is an old friend of his that he's bringing home, but then it materializes that Mr. Shear is not an old friend of Hector's. He's not even a new friend of Hector's. He's more or less just an acquaintance, but he happens to be someone who investigates the paranormal. And he doesn't believe in the paranormal. His intention in his paranormal investigations is to debunk them. And, Hector thinks that the thing he's going to do is he's going to prove that Madeline is being ridiculous, and show her that this is just all in her imagination. Now, this goes over exactly as well as you think it's going to. As my grandmother used to say, it went over like a pregnant pole vaulter. And, she's furious. And Stella is angry as well, on Madeline's behalf and on her own behalf as well, because she's more or less believing by this stage that there is something wrong at Grayswick. But they don't really have a say in it ultimately, because this is 1917, 1918. This is a time when, men still are very much in charge. And it's Hector's home, so he is allowed to do this. And so Mr. Shear is given a guest room, and he gets to work trying to prove that there is nothing wrong, to find a non-paranormal explanation for the strange things that are happening. And they're happening both outside and inside Stella and Madeline's rooms. And Stella, of course, we have to remember she's still very much grieving Gerald's death. And she feels in this sort of strange position, because she feels like a widow and she is wearing all black. But she's not a widow. They were not yet married. They were engaged. They were going to be married. They would have married, but Gerald obviously dies, so they don't. So she's in this sort of strange liminal state of not really a widow, but not really, a single woman either. And her mourning isn't really understood or respected by her family, or by others, frankly, who think she's just, well, as they would have put it, that she's becoming hysterical, which is just such a sexist diagnosis. But effectively what they mean is that she is just sort of caught in her grief. And she's kind of getting that vibe a bit from Hector. She's getting it from Mrs. Brightwell. She's even getting it to a degree from Mr. Shear, although he seems a little more respectful. Not at first, but increasingly, particularly once she tells him off and they then have a proper conversation. And meanwhile, should I tell you this? I'm believe it or not, I'm not giving away many spoilers. Everything I've told you so far happens pretty early on. I suppose it is worth mentioning, and this is not really a spoiler. It is hinted at. It is hinted at right from the beginning, and it is revealed very early on. But if you don't want to know, you can look away, cover your ears, mute the volume now. But Annie is, in fact, able to speak with ghosts. As she would go on to say, she doesn't necessarily have a conversation with them in the way that two people might converse, but rather they show her things, they help her to understand things. She can see them, she can hear them, she can interact with them, and she is absolutely certain that Grayswick is haunted. She has seen manifestations, and she knows that the place is haunted. Now, okay, so spoiler over. So at this point, what happens is effectively the story turns into a kind of detective novel, but a detective novel with paranormal twist. And honestly, I've always thought that that's, ghost stories and murder mysteries, they actually have a lot in common. It's just that in the case of the ghost story, the dead person is helping you solve their death. Okay. Which doesn't tend to happen in murder mysteries. Not directly, anyway. They might indirectly through things they've left behind, but their spirit is not communicating with the detectives. If it is, then we've crossed the line into paranormal and into ghost story territory. So this is very much a detective story with the lead detective, in a sense, Mr. Shear, Tristan Shear, trying to prove that this isn't a haunting, and Madeline and Stella and in particular Stella, trying to prove that actually it is. And throughout this, no pun intended, but the specter of her grief hangs over all of this, and people's concerns about her grief and her mental state. Her parents continue to worry, and particularly once she starts talking about that Grayswick is haunted, they become extremely concerned. They are not, any of them, willing to tolerate the idea that there might actually be a haunting there. They are just assuming that something is really wrong with Stella mentally, that she has infected Madeline with this. Even though Madeline was the first one to think Grayswick is haunted. And eventually Madeline is sent to her parents' home, and it's just Stella, Mr. Shear, and Annie who are investigating what has happened, who the ghost is, why the ghost is there, all of that. And they do solve the murder. There is a murder. They do solve the mystery. And that I will not reveal. This is too new a book. It is what, 6.5, not quite 6.5 years old. No, it is 6.5 years old. And it's just not right to reveal that at this stage. I think, as I've said in the past videos, my moratorium for spoilers is usually about sort of 20-30 years. I figure you've had time by then. This is nowhere near that threshold. So I've given away a tiny, tiny, tiny spoiler, but not one that's going to ruin the book for you. And honestly, because I've now gone through this book twice, as both an ebook and as an audiobook, and knowing it, knowing what happens when I read it through the second time, it doesn't spoil it. You just notice more details, to be honest. But still, I won't spoil it. I'll just leave that part at that, and talk more now about the sort of themes of this book. Because obviously one of the big ones here is grief. And, there's Stella's grief for Gerald. There's Mr. Shear's own grief that he's dealing with. He was invalided out of the war. He was gravely injured. He has lost one of his legs, the lower leg. And, he can manage stairs and so forth, but it's not easy. He can walk, but it's not, it's not easy. He is still adjusting to the loss of his leg. And, he is also, and so he's grieving the loss of his own sort of plans, his lost future as he sees it, and the sort of how he's changed his life, or having to change his life going forward because of what he's experienced, as well as, what we would now term PTSD from the war. And frankly, Stella and Mr. Shear are both suffering from PTSD. Different causes, maybe taking slightly different forms, but both suffering it nonetheless. And of course, to call it PTSD is anachronistic. That is not how it was described at that point. This is actually the period when PTSD is really first beginning to be discussed and sort of thought about in psychological terms. I'm sure people noticed this before. The First World War is not the first war where people who live through it suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's the first, I think, where it is really observed and put together with the emerging science of psychiatry and psychology. And at the time, they call it shell shock. It is still very misunderstood. There are some men who have quite severe cases of shell shock who are actually executed for dereliction of duty. They're court-martialed and executed. It's really, really terrible. And so their grief, their trauma is not understood. We, as modern readers, over 100 years later, can read this novel and go, okay, that's what's happening. They don't yet have that tool. They don't yet have that language to talk about it. They don't really have that concept yet. And so that is something they're struggling with. The Marchams, Stella's family, are still, of course, dealing with the grief of the very horrible, tragic loss of Stella's and Madeline's sister and grandmother from the fire. So, in addition, to the Marcham's grief, Annie Burroughs is grieving. She is grieving the death of her father, and suddenly being, them making her a servant in their home. They see it as a charitable thing. She just accepts it. She's very young at the time that this all happens. She's still very young when the story starts, because I believe the fire is only about 5 years before the story that we've got takes place. And so she's still grieving him. And she is also, and this is again spoiler, related to the spoiler earlier. So, 2, 3, 2, 1. She is very uncomfortable with her gift, with her abilities. She wishes she were normal. She doesn't like that she can see spirits. This really bothers her quite a lot, and she has to learn over the course of the story to accept her gift. She always believed it's real. It's not that she ever thinks this isn't real. It's just that it singles her out. It makes her different, and people notice her that she's different. And they don't always know why, but even when they do know why, that doesn't really help. So she really is not happy about this ability. And she has to both grieve her father and learn to accept herself. And I think that there is also, coming back, I think there is also a degree of self-acceptance that Mr. Shear needs to go through as well. The loss of his leg and all of that, and how he has to deal with that mentally and emotionally, as well as practically. And I won't go into this because this is really going into major spoiler territory. But I will say that the elder Mrs. Brightwell, Madeline's mother-in-law, she too is suffering, although and Miss Scott, they are suffering from grief. Miss Scott is also, in particular, suffering a great deal of guilt, and she needs to find self-acceptance as well. And then, in the midst of all of this, is Mrs. Hinge, the head housekeeper. And boy, is she a horrible person. She's very severe. She's very unkind. She's very strict. She's very unforgiving. And she gives off a very strange vibe that, Madeline notices, that Stella notices. Madeline, I believe, if memory serves, Madeline kind of more or less, warns Stella, she's tough, don't get on her wrong side. But yeah, Mrs. Hinge serves there's this kind of classic role, I think, in this kind of traditional ghost story of the very strange, very strict, quietly menacing figure who has full run of the house. And she does in a way that even Mrs. Brightwell or Madeline or Hector, they don't have, because while of course it is, their home, they can technically go anywhere, social custom and class, issues and things would mean that there are certain parts of the house where it's seen as unusual for them to go, particularly the servants' quarters, the sort of areas like the kitchens and so forth. That is not really their domain, as it were. They can go there, and there are occasions where it would be appropriate, but not typically. Whereas Mrs. Hinge, she goes everywhere. As head housekeeper, she is both front of house and back of house, as it were, to sort of use restaurant terminology. And that means she knows the place like the back of her hand. She's been there for decades. And she rules the roost in all kinds of ways. All I'll say is that they're right to be concerned about Mrs. Hinge. And that's all I'm saying about her. But, she is the danger. She is the threat. There is as well the ghost. It is haunted. We find out relatively quickly that Madeline, even if not everybody is ready to accept it, Madeline knows what she's talking about. Stella knows what she's talking about. Annie knows what she's talking about. This house, Grayswick, is haunted. And the ghost is on a mission. Okay? So, dealing with grief, dealing with self-acceptance, dealing with the traumas, the post-traumatic stress disorders, these are ultimately the main themes of the book. And I think these are because they're dealing with these things and going through, sort of, obviously you don't completely overcome such things, but she does learn to accept, she does grow, she does feel better by the end. She finds a way through her grief. And, the haunting and dealing with the haunting and investigating the haunting with Annie and with Mr. Shear, these help her to face and to deal with the incredibly debilitating grief that she is suffering. And I think it's because of this that this novel is very much elevated from, if there is such a thing as just a ghost story, this isn't just a ghost story. And I think the themes that we're dealing with here really do elevate this into something that, just about anyone can relate to. And I mean, the ghost story, even a comic ghost story, there is always tragedy behind it. You don't just end up as a ghost for fun necessarily. I don't know, maybe some people do. But, maybe they just really like a place and they're not ready to leave it. But I think particularly in these kinds of stories, when there is a ghost, it is because there has been a tragedy. And the lost ones, and this name I think it does a lot of heavy lifting. It's a really great title for this story. That says that this is a tragedy. And I mean, I even think about, even a show like Ghosts, the series Ghosts, whether you're talking about the original British version, which is one of my go-tos. I love that series. The US version, which I've not seen all of it yet, because it's not all yet available here in the UK. But I will be catching up on it as soon as possible. That one is, I'm a big fan of. I haven't seen the other versions. Apparently there's a German one, an Australian one, and a Greek one. But I have not seen those. I've only seen the British and American. But anyway, sorry. Even there, these are it's a comedy. And yet when we get the backstories of the individual ghosts, of how they end up dying and becoming ghosts at Button House, I forget what the house is called in the American version. In the British version, it's Button House. It is tragic what happens to them. Their lives are sad, difficult, and their deaths are tragic. And, they have to deal with that. And I think although it's not quite the same, I do think this isn't really a spoiler. This is my supposition, and I'll do it in as spoiler-free a way as possible. I think that the ghosts in The Lost Ones are themselves dealing with grief. They are dealing with trauma, and that is the reason that they haunt. And resolving the haunting in part means helping them to resolve their trauma. Okay? So the lost ones are, the ghosts, Stella and Gerald. Madeline as well, to a degree. She's obviously the loss of their sister, but she has also had one or two miscarriages by this stage and is very, very, protective of, very concerned about her current pregnancy, mourning the losses of those previous pregnancies. So, she is dealing with stuff. She's not quite lost, but things have not been easy for her. And as we come to find out, Miss Scott is dealing with things and loss, and Mrs. Brightwell, we will come to find, has her own great losses to deal with. One in particular loss that she will become more aware of later on in the story, and when the novel ends, that is when she's beginning to be able to deal with it, or beginning to address it. Let's put it that way. So there is loss upon loss upon loss, grief upon grief upon grief, trauma upon trauma upon trauma. These are lost individuals who must find a way back. Okay? So that's why I think, that the title is a brilliant title for the story, and B, why this novel packs the punch that it does. It carries so much weight, and it makes it, even though it is set as a period novel, and I think there are reasons for that work very well. I don't think you could necessarily just lift that and put it in any time period and it worked just as well. You would have to make some somewhat substantive changes in order to make that work. So I think the setting is a really interesting one, a really good one. So yeah, as far as scary, again, and I've said this before, I have a super high threshold for being scared, and never once did this story scare me or creep me out in any way, shape, or form. I did not find it at all frightening. Others might. I didn't. And I'm very aware of that. But saying that, I still thought this was a beautiful story. I thought it was extremely well written. I really, really came to like the characters very much, in particular Stella as the lead character. And I definitely recommend this book. The only reason I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 is because I didn't find it at all scary at any point, and I do think that should be present in a ghost story. But I am aware that I'm a tough one as far as that goes. But still. So that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed my review of The Lost Ones by Anita Frank. It is out there in actual book, ebook, audiobook. I've not heard of any, and I did try to look into this before starting this video, and I couldn't find out anything about any sort of plans for an adaptation in the future or anything like that. So this looks like, at least for now, this is a standalone story. But you can get it in multiple forms, and I definitely recommend it. If you want a really good old-fashioned ghost story, this is right for you. Okay? So that's all, and I will see you next week for another episode. Good night. Sleep tight. Don't let the nightmares bite. Bye.